Why not ratify the Treaty of Versailles? Because Wilson wouldn't negotiate with U.S. government. No, that's the 1940s and 50s. The fear of communists in the government, fears of communists in radio and TV and all that. Red Scare and immigration. There was a cartoon about vicious aliens being deported by Uncle Sam. Okay. The Palmer raids were the purpose of to get rid of communists. The effect of it ended the Red Scare, but it disregarded our rights or the Bill of Rights. Yes, it did. Any questions about the Red Scare? Okay, 1920 election, Debs' role. He runs for the 4th time. He doesn't do as well this time. He had done much better in earlier elections, like 1912. And the other 2 candidates are Warren G. Harding and a guy named Cox, who was the governor of New York. It was the Democratic candidate. Warren G. Harding runs on a platform of normalcy, which means... Pardon me? Yeah, go back to the olden days. Go back to the 1880s. Laissez-faire economy. The government's not making a lot of changes. Get rid of the progressive ideas. Okay, so what we've done already for progressives we'll keep in place, like we'll leave women getting the right to vote, we'll leave prohibition, but we're not going to do anything else, okay? So go back to pre-progressives and to a laissez-faire government where you're not making regulations and rules. Republicans did what in the 1920s? Did they reduce tariffs? No, they did not, because they wanted to protect American industry. Did they reduce taxes? Yes. Do you see the next term? Andrew Mellon supported supply-side economics, and supply-side economics is where you cut taxes on the rich and they'll reinvest their wealth in business and create jobs and that kind of stuff. Sometimes referred to as trickle down also. Did they encourage labor unions? No. Okay, they did not like labor unions. Did they regulate business? No. The opposite is, in fact, that Ben said laissez-faire. Remember, that's no government regulation or little as possible. Did they encourage company unions, meaning unions just for Dillon's specific company? No, they did not encourage unions of any ilk or type. Okay, Andrew Mellon supported what? We talked about that. Teapot Dome cartoon. One of the things that marks the Harding administration are scandals. Poor President Harding was really not a great leader. He was more interested in playing poker at his mistress's house and drinking illegal booze. Okay? His friends were very interested in making a fast buck off the government, and his Secretary of Interior, a man named Albert Fall, made arrangements to lease government land to some oil companies in California and Wyoming for personal loans, which in real language would be bribes, okay? So there's a Teapot Dome cartoon with this big monster thing. It looks a lot like Frankenstein, and it, instead of having across its chest it says oil scandal, and it's carrying the president around. And it refers to Teapot Dome, okay? All the following are characteristics of the 1920s except better race relations. There weren't good race relations. Remember that when black troops came home from the war, they expected to be treated equally to whites. They weren't. There were a lot more lynchings right after the war than there had been even before. Blacks found out that all those jobs that they took during the war in northern factories, suddenly they lost because white guys came back from the war and wanted the jobs back. Okay. What did farmers want in the 1920s? They wanted parity or price supports, which means what?
Guarantee.
Right, the government would guarantee a price. In 1917, 18, 19, farmers in America made a fortune because they were feeding a lot of Europe too. So the price of wheat was almost as high in 1919 as it was in 2010. Literally, I'm serious about that. Difference was in 1919 they didn't produce as much as we produce today per bushel per acre, but the price was really high. By 1920, the price of wheat falls dramatically because Europe is back producing its own wheat. It doesn't need to buy much American wheat, but farmers continue to produce. The other thing that's happened in the 19-teens is that tractors, real tractors, have come into being. So now Mr. Smith, the farmer, can plow up a lot more field at a lot quicker time with his tractor than he could with the horse and plow. So he starts growing more, which then consequently does what to the price? Lowers it even more. So farmers wanted the government to guarantee a price. This was proposed in the McNary-Haugen bill. That's what the McNary-Haugen bill wants, price support. Why was it vetoed? Because it was not seen as being laissez-faire. How was the McNary-Haugen price support going to be paid for? By a tax on food? So the presidents kept vetoing the bill. So one of the indications that the economy is not real strong in the 1920s is the bad farm economic situation, okay? The attitude of Harding and Coolidge toward business, what's the quote? The business of America is business, okay? So less a fair government, unless it's something that will help business, then the government should get involved. Who said raise wages and lower cost? Henry Ford. He started paying his workers a living wage of $5 a day for two reasons. One, to make what? Well, you know what? If you didn't come to work in those days, what happened to your job? You lost it.
They made them do a good job.
Okay, so they did a better job and they didn't strike and they didn't join unions. That's one reason, okay? He hated unions and he didn't want his workers joining them and he didn't want them striking. And he, of course, wanted them to do a good job. So that all wraps into one thing. The other thing is they could afford to buy a car, which meant the production of a lot more cars. So that's why he wants to raise wages, and he does, and that's what happens in the 1920s in general. A graph of the price of the Model T. Why did it fall? Because the assembly line made it inexpensive. That's part of lowering the cost. What he observed was that that team of 4 to 6 who had built a car prior were very efficient, but he decided that if he made you stand in one spot all day long and screw in the same 2 screws and the car came to you and then went on to the next guy for him to screw in 2 more screws or whatever, that ultimately you could make a car even less expensively and faster. And they did. They turned over a lot more cars each day than they had before. Isolationism. A quote in a cartoon, what is isolationism? It's our foreign policy during the 1920s, but what does that mean? The idea is that we don't get involved politically or diplomatically with other countries, okay? And technically isolationism should mean that you don't get involved economically, right? Which is what Jared just said. But did we in the 1920s keep back economically?
Yes.
No. Because we wanted Europeans to buy American products like cars, refrigerators, radios, etc. Okay? So we didn't keep back economically. Now, was trade in the 1920s like trade is right now? No way. I mean, we imported some stuff and we exported a lot more stuff. But it wasn't, the world was not one big economic community like we think of today. In the 1920s, how did we go against isolationism? We continued to trade. The Washington Naval Conference, which we'll talk about in a minute, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, those are all examples of going against isolationism, okay? We were already, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, we had flexed our muscles with the big stick diplomacy, and we kind of liked the idea of being a world power. And it's hard to turn down that kind of juicy sentiment or that surge of power that it gets you when you know that you've been the reason that World War I, was won for the Allies, that kind of thing.